Would've, Could've, Should've by Taylor Swift. The last song I covered on this channel was Dear John from Taylor Swift's Speak Now album. Now, Dear John is clearly a song about John Mayer. There's no real secret about that. She's talking about a relationship that took place in 2009, 2010. And so at the time of recording the Speak Now album, that would have been fairly fresh in her mind. In the course of making that video, I said that I should probably do Would've, Could've, Should've next, and that's what I'm going to do. Now, this is a song from the Midnights album, one of the bonus tracks on one of the various extended versions of the album. And it's abundantly clear from the lyrics that this is also a song about her relationship with John Mayer. The thing about this is that it's written some 12 or 13 years after that relationship. And the emotions expressed in this song, if anything, are more raw, perhaps even more bitter than the emotions that she expresses in Dear John. And I speculated in talking about Dear John as to why she would have written and recorded Would've, Should've, Could've in 2022, so many years after the event. Of course, I have no real answer to that question, but one of the things that did occur to me was that she was re-recording Speak Now at around the same time, and so perhaps re-recording Dear John brought that all back to her. There's also, of course, the theme of the album, Midnights, which is about the midnight hour when she's ruminating, when she can't sleep, and all these thoughts are going through her mind. And so perhaps that's what was happening here also. She was reliving this relationship, reliving some of these feelings. So in a moment, I'm going to have a look at that song, the lyric video of that song. And afterwards, I'm going to link that to this idea of religious imagery in Taylor's writing. It would probably be possible to do a 30-minute or hour-long video, I think, on exploring this particular issue. So I'll just be touching on it a little bit here. Maybe that's something I'll do in full at another time. The other thing I want to say before diving into the song itself is that as much as this is clearly a song about a specific relationship, I'd like us to try to understand this more as a statement of a kind of experience, detach it to some extent from the specifics, and try to understand more the emotional state that is being described here and the nature of the relationship that is being described here. That may or may not be easy to do. So let's jump into the lyric video, Would've, Should've, Could've from Midnights.
If you would've blinked, then I would've looked away at the first glance.
Taylor plunges us right here directly into the world of what if. She's here looking back on events that took place many years ago and asking the question, what if I'd behaved differently? If he had blinked then, she would have looked away, and what followed never would have happened. That's the implication here. But he held her gaze. So I think that's very important. They made this connection through their eyes.
If you would've blinked, then I would've looked away at the first glance. If you tasted poison, you could've spit me out at the first chance.
Here she's addressing this experience from his point of view, almost posing this as a kind of question, I suppose. If you tasted poison, you could have spit me out at the first chance. I suppose in a way the same could be said of her. If she tasted poison, she could have spit him out at the first chance as well. But at the beginning of this relationship, there was none of that. There was just the shared gaze.
If you tasted poison, you could have spit me out at the first chance. If I was some paint, did it splatter on a promising grown man? And if
There's a bit of a back and forth here. Now she's asking, did she somehow stain him? Again, it's not explicitly asked as a question, but I sense a question here. Did she somehow splatter him with paint in that moment, staining him in some way, so that he couldn't just wash her out? This is all speculation in Taylor's mind at midnight about those first, perhaps even moments of this relationship, of what took place in those first few moments, and what might have been if it didn't take place.
If I was some paint, did it splatter on a promising grown man? And if I was a child, did it matter if you got to wash your hands?
Now it's back on him again. If I was a child, what did it matter if you could wash your hands? This has a slightly accusatory feel to it as well. Perhaps even then you saw me as a child, but it didn't matter to you because you could wash your hands of me. There's a surprising amount of bitterness in this for a relationship that ended 12, 13 years ago. But let's detach ourselves from that fact for a moment and just look at this as an analysis of a relationship, of the dynamics of a relationship that's ended badly, and the person is now reflecting upon those initial moments of what was taking place there. What signs were there? What was in your mind? What was in my mind? Let's just run back through that series of lyrics again.
If you would have blinked, then I would have looked away at the first glance. If you tasted poison, you could have spit me out at the first chance. If I was some paint, did it splatter on a promising grown man? And if I was a child, did it matter if you got to wash your hands? All I used to do was pray. Would've, could've, should've, if you'd never looked my way.
So here we get to the heart of the song here, exploring both fate and responsibility, I think, to some extent. Now she's asking the question, again, it's not explicitly expressed as a question, but I sense a question there. But it's also an admonition. Looking back on it now from my position, what would I have done differently? What could I have done differently? What should I have done differently? And we get the beginnings here of that religious imagery too. I would have stayed on my knees. So we're exploring here the loss of innocence. And the innocence is expressed in this image of a young girl on her knees.
All I used to do was pray. Would've, could've, should've, if you'd never looked my way. I would've stayed on my knees, and a damn sure never would've danced with the devil.
She sees him as a source of temptation. This is where she lost her innocence. And in that sense, he is here for her, the representative of the devil. This was a crucial moment in her life. This young girl, when she's making these decisions, experiencing these feelings, and now later in life reflecting back, and with hindsight asking what she should have done differently. She should have stayed on her knees. She should have stayed in that state of innocence. Of course, that's impossible. It could never have happened. But that's the feeling she's expressing here.
I would have stayed on my knees, and I damn sure never would have danced with the devil. At 19, and the God's honest truth is that the pain was heaven.
And this line here, and the God's honest truth was that the pain was heaven. This is a very powerful line, and it's expressing a very powerful reality, that it's often the pain, the danger, that attracts us into a situation. There's a line in another song from the Tortured Poets Department, and I can't off the top of my head remember which song it's from, but the words are to the effect that the relationship was no longer interesting, no longer exciting when it wasn't forbidden. So there's that whole thing about forbidden fruit. So we have here that the whole image from the Garden of Eden here, and the loss of innocence, and him as the devil or the serpent in the garden. But this is a deep acknowledgement that part of the attraction was the very pain that she was feeling. We talk about a broken heart. We talk about aching with love. Pain is always associated with love, at least in those initial moments, and probably in the later moments too, when this love has passed. So pain and love are intimately related. There'd be no need really to talk about temptation if there wasn't danger involved with what's tempting us. When we feel hunger, we eat food, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when we feel tempted to eat that extra chocolate, we're tempted, and not just desirous of it, but tempted by it because we perceive that there's something wrong with it. There's something wrong with that action. So there is innately bound up with the idea of temptation that something is to be avoided. And that's what we see here in these initial moments of this relationship. We feel the power of temptation, and now in the years later, looking back, the questions being asked, what should we have done differently? What were you thinking at that time? What was I thinking at that time?
I would have stayed on my knees, and I damn sure never would have danced with the devil at 19. And the God's honest truth is that the pain was heaven. And now that I'm grown, I'm scared of ghosts. Memories feel like weapons.
So she's exploring the long-term effects of this on her. This was a critical point in her life. This was a turning point in her life. This was her fall and her expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And even though it's so long ago, in her midnights, she's haunted by this experience. She's haunted by the ghosts of this experience.
Now that I'm grown, I'm scared of ghosts. Memories feel like weapons. And now that I know, I wish you'd left me wondering.
There's an interesting idea too. I mean, she's saying here that she'd rather not have known. I'm probably reading too much into this, but in the Garden of Eden, the sin of Adam and Eve, and initially of Eve, of course, is to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's what Taylor's doing here. She's eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And she's posing the question, if I'd known the consequences of that, would I have chosen not to know? Would I have chosen ignorance? She said, I wish you'd left me wondering. But is that really better? Is it better not to know? I would argue that it's better to know. That the only way forward, even though it comes at a great price, is from eating the forbidden fruit.
Now that I know, I wish you'd left me wondering. If you never touched me, I would have gone along with the righteous.
The relationship now seems to be moving into a deeper level. We've gone past the first shared look, and now we're talking about touching. But again, the word righteous here, again, strongly religious imagery. The idea that there was something unrighteous, something unholy about their physical contact. And perhaps there was, given the age difference. And I guess that's where some of the bitterness comes through as well. He should have known better. She feels, given the choice now, that she would have stayed with the righteous. Could she? Could any of us? Isn't that level of righteousness and purity a complete and utter illusion?
If you never touched me, I would have gone along with the righteous. If I never blushed, then they could have never whispered about this.
There's this back and forth still in these verses. Now she's acknowledging her response to the touch. Even if it wasn't a physical touch, even if it was just the look, she blushed. The blush is her response. This is her body, her mind, her spirit responding to the stimulus that he is providing her. And that is the beginning of guilt, if you like. That is the beginning of the fall. Now, I'm not saying this in a judgmental way because I don't see this image of the fall as a bad thing, as a bad experience at all. I see it as a necessary step in growing up and in moving forward. So I'm not at all judging Taylor in this. Her response is perfectly natural and particularly of a young girl faced with a very charming older man. But some in the theological traditions would argue that even to feel tempted, even to have that initial response, is already to have fallen.
If I never blushed, then they could have never whispered about this. And if you never saved me from boredom, I could have gone on as I was.
This was an exciting adventure, and she couldn't resist it. Again, she says she would have gone on as she was. This, I think, is a complete falsehood. Whether she believes that herself, I seriously doubt it. But this idea that if only she'd made a different decision at that point, everything would have gone along smoothly from that point onwards. Clearly, it wouldn't. That is completely untrue. But she can't help thinking and feeling that.
If you never saved me from boredom, I could have gone on as I was. But Lord, you made me feel important, and then you tried to erase us all.
So here she's clearly assigning blame to him, again, as the adult in the room. He made her feel important. Again, this is a 19-year-old girl faced with a musician that she probably admired, a 32-year-old man. She couldn't resist the temptation. She couldn't resist the feelings that were being engendered within her. She couldn't resist the temptation of the adventure, of the excitement, of the pain. He made her feel important. And this is so important here because now it becomes something of a game on his part. This speaks to Taylor's own insecurities at that time, but who at 19 isn't insecure? Who at 67 isn't insecure?
On as I was, but Lord, you made me feel important, and then you tried to erase us all.
Of course, then there comes the flip, doesn't there? When he's played the game and won the game and got all he can out of the game, he then flips it around and tries to erase the experience, belittles it, says it was nothing, it was just a fling, we were just having a good time, and so on.
And then you tried to erase us all. You're a crisis of my faith. Would've, could've, should've. If I'd only played it safe, I would've.
There we see it again, this tension that Taylor expresses again and again in terms of her relationships, this need for excitement, adventure, danger, and this other need for safety and security. We see this tug of war again happening here. And she states explicitly here that this was a crisis of faith for her. This is all about faith in herself, in the image she had of herself at the time, the image she tried to project to others. This changed her entire perception of herself. After this experience, she was no longer the same person as she was before the experience. And she wonders what would have happened if she could have avoided this experience. Would she have stayed the same? Would things have gone on the same? Well, I don't think that they would, nor do I think that they should.
You're a crisis of my faith. Would've, could've, should've. If I'd only played it safe, I would've stayed on my knees. And I damn sure never would've danced with the devil at 19. And the God's honest truth is that the pain was heaven. And now that I'm grown, I'm scared of ghosts. Memories feel like weapons. And now that I know, I wish you left me wondering. God rest my soul, I miss who I used to be. The tomb won't close, stained glass
God rest my soul. So there's a funereal aspect to the imagery now. The tomb won't close. She can't bury this experience. She can't shut the door on this experience. She misses who she used to be. This is also a grieving process. See, at the end of this relationship, she doesn't just grieve the relationship, she grieves her old self. She grieves all that died at that moment and all that might have been if she makes different choices. The word decision comes from a Latin word meaning to cut. It's like incision. And when you make a decision, you cut off other possibilities for your life. And that's what she's describing here. She made a decision at this point, and she wonders what life would have been like if she'd made a different decision. But that can't be. She cut off other possibilities, and she grieves those other possibilities. No matter what you choose in life, you can always grieve the other possibilities.
God rest my soul. I miss who I used to be. The tomb won't close. Stained glass windows in my mind. I regret you all the time.
This is a painful line to read, particularly when you think about the fact that this relationship was so long ago, so many years ago. I regret you all the time. That's a very, very sad line. And I hope for her sake it's not true. But I really think this is one of the Midnight's experiences. It's going to sound very, very silly, but I remember in my younger days going to a job interview. And I said some very silly things and some very embarrassing things. It doesn't matter what they were. But I felt enormously embarrassed at the time, and I came away from that experience sort of ruminating, going over it again and again in my mind. What did I say? For goodness sake, what should I have said? Well, that's blown that, hasn't it? And of course, that was years ago, and it wasn't really all that important in the scheme of things, not the way this was. But I can still generate the feeling of embarrassment and shame that I felt when I went through that experience, even without remembering precisely what it was that I said at the time, or even what the job was. I have no idea. But I can conjure up within myself the shame and embarrassment that I felt at that moment. And that can happen to me with this or other experiences in those moments during the night when maybe you fall asleep and then you wake up again for some reason. And from that point on, you just can't go back to sleep. Your mind is racing, you're ruminating, you're going over all these things in your mind. And sometimes something as ridiculous and insignificant as a job interview that took place 30 years ago can suddenly rear its ugly head again and make me feel those emotions again. Somehow they're embedded in me somewhere. They're part of the building blocks that made me who I am today. And so I can understand the feeling of regret that comes up at these moments of vulnerability, of weakness.
God rest my soul. I miss who I used to be. The tomb won't close. Stained glass windows in my mind. I regret you all the time. I can't let this go. I fight with you in my sleep. The wound won't close. I keep on waiting for a sign.
The wound won't close. That's an alternative image to the tomb won't close. So the wound remains open even after all these years, or every so often it will open up again. And for some reason, at this time when she wrote this song, the wound was open again. I fight with you in my sleep. Again, arguments that I will go through in my mind over and over again. What could I have said? What should I have said? What did I say? And all the feelings that go with that.
I can't let this go. I fight with you in my sleep. The wound won't close. I keep on waiting for a sign.
And we're still with the religious imagery here because the sign is a religious idea as well. She seems here to be saying she's waiting for a sign from the universe that this is all over now, that the wound is healed, that the tomb is closed. but the sign doesn't come.
Keep on waiting for a sign. I regret you all the time. If clarity's in death, then why won't this die? Years of tearing down our banners, you and I.
Again, we have references to death here, like the tomb. If clarity's in death, then why won't this die? Where does the idea that clarity comes in death? I guess that's also a religious image. The idea of full insight, full enlightenment coming to us only after death. But this relationship, or at least the wound she carries from this relationship, won't die.
Then why won't this die? Years of tearing down our banners, you and I. Living for the thrill of hitting you where it hurts. Give me back my girl, that it was mine first.
That's just a heartrending line, isn't it? Give me back my girlhood, it was mine first. So this is that sense of loss. This is what she feels that she lost at this point. And clearly at the moment of writing and recording this song, she is feeling that intensely.
Living for the thrill of hitting you where it hurts. Give me back my girl, that it was mine first. And I damn sure never would have danced with the devil at 19. And the God's honest truth is that the pain was heaven. And now that I'm grown, I'm scared of ghosts. Memories feel like weapons. And now that I know, I wish you left me wondering. God rest my soul, I miss who I used to be. The tomb won't close, stained glass windows in my mind. I regret you all the time. I can't let this go. I fight with you in my sleep, the wound won't close. I keep on waiting for a sign. I regret you all the time. Oh, God, rest my soul, I miss who I used to be. The tomb won't close, stained glass windows in my mind. I regret you all the time. I can't let this go. I fight with you in my sleep, the wound won't close. I keep on waiting for a sign. I regret you all the time.
One of the things I want to do is reflect on the universality of the message here. And although this is clearly rooted in a very specific experience, this is actually one of the most universal messages that Taylor could ever give. And I say that because, in my opinion, speaking here as a former Anglican priest who used to teach about things like sin and guilt and the fall and all that sort of stuff, salvation, on and on it goes, I've long since come to interpret that, particularly the fall, in psychological terms. And Taylor is here describing that precisely. What the fall is not this rebellion against God. What the fall is decision making. When you make a decision, you cut off other possibilities and you potentially grieve those other possibilities. You lose your innocence at these crucial points when you make these decisions. Making a decision, choosing this rather than that, cutting off this possibility in favour of that possibility, that is the experience, the universal experience of falling. And we all hark back to that mythical Eden before we made that decision, to the time before we lost these possibilities, to that time of innocence. Innocence is lost when we make decisions, good or bad decisions. Innocence is lost. And we can lose ourselves in the what if of this. What if I'd made a different decision? If only I'd done this instead. That's part of the fall. That's part of the loss experience that the fall, I think, represents. Expressed in religious terms, but I think to be understood in psychological terms. So I think regardless of the specific event that triggers it for you in your life, there is always going to be one or more, maybe many moments in your life that are in effect mini falls because they constitute losses. Yes, there may be gains, but no matter what the gains are, there are also losses, losses of possibility, losses of potential. And the harking back to that innocent state before decisions were made is part of what's going on in this song. Hence, I think, the very strong religious imagery that's running through it. But I gave a particular subtitle to this video, Religious Imagery in the Writing of Taylor Swift. And while I'm not going to do a deep dive into that, there's one specific aspect of it that I want to discuss here today in relation to this song. And that's to do with the fact that I think Taylor elevates relationships to a religious status, to the height of spiritual experience. I don't think that the relationship is a sacrament in the sense that it's a pathway to holiness. I think she sees the relationship itself as holy, sacrosanct, sacred. Think of All Too Well, where she says, "You kept me like a secret, but I kept you like an oath, sacred prayer." A relationship for her is a commitment on the level of a religious commitment, a sacred experience. In Guilty as Sin, when she's really only contemplating a relationship, only fantasizing about a relationship, she says, "What if I roll the stone away?" In other words, what if I get out of the tomb? They're going to crucify me anyway, right? So the religious imagery is really obvious. But then she says, what if the way you hold me is actually what's holy? A relationship is a religious experience for Taylor. And I don't think here this only refers to romantic relationships. I think she has particularly close relationships with her parents. And I think this closeness, this also is a sacred relationship. The relationship between parent and child. It's not just romantic relationships that are sacred. And she has this relationship with her parents. And I think this has become her expectation of all relationships, romantic, even just friendships. Friendships are sacred experiences for Taylor. In that same song, Guilty as Sin, she finishes that little section with, "I choose you and me religiously." I think here she's making it completely explicit. Relationships for her are religious experiences. Relationships are holy. And that's why betrayal is so much worse for her than it may be for most of us. And the problem with this, of course, is that no relationship of any kind, whether it's a parent-child relationship, a friendship, or a romantic relationship, no relationship can ever live up to this ideal. And I think Taylor actually recognizes this herself. And she expresses it in False God from the Lover album. It's astonishing to me that this song is from way back in 2019 on this Lover album. I've mentioned before some of the red flags that I think appear on this album with hindsight. And this song in particular, is one of them. She says, "They say the road gets hard and you get lost when you're led by blind faith, blind faith." And here she's talking about relationships. In the chorus she sings, "But we might just get away with it. Religion's in your lips. Even if it's a false god, we still worship. We might just get away with it. The altar is my hips. Even if it's a false god, we'd still worship this love." It's clear to me from this that Taylor understands this religious dimension to her relationships, or how it feels to her like a religious experience. But she also recognizes that this can blind you, blind faith. The road gets hard and you get lost when you're led by blind faith. So she knows that in these relationships she has this tendency to go in with blind faith, too much trust. too much vulnerability. She gives too much of herself. But she continues to hope that they just might get away with it. They just might get away with it this time. Even if it's a false god, we'd still worship this love. And in verse 2 of False God, she says, I know heaven's a thing. I go there when you touch me, honey. Hell is when I fight with you, but we can patch it up good. So, because for her relationships possess this almost heavenly quality, when they go wrong, they become hellish. They're the two sides of the religious spiritual coin. She goes from heaven to hell. And so in LOML on the Tortured Poets Department, she sings, when your impressionist paintings of heaven turn out to be fakes, well, you took me to hell too. So I think she recognizes that she tends to elevate relationships, all kinds of relationships, to this kind of heavenly spiritual status, so that they become the meaning and center of her life. And when they fail, she goes to hell. So again, returning to the universal, I think we have here a universal pattern. And that is that we can all have this tendency to value some things too highly. And there's always, well, one, there's the temptation to do that, to fall all the way into that. But the other, which is equally a temptation, is to avoid that and to end up not valuing anything enough. And that's a very difficult line to walk through life. I find it very difficult not to fall into certain patterns of behavior. And I think this is one of the universal things that's being expressed not only in this song, but through some of her other songs too. There is that sense of here we go again. In Would've, Could've, Should've, she sees this particular moment when she was 19, this particular relationship as a pivotal point, a point when everything changed. And she mourns the loss of who she was and also the loss of who she might have been. Taylor's expressing this universal sense that we have lost something. We've lost some ideal past, whether that's as the human race, who've lost the Garden of Eden, or whether it's as individuals who've lost their innocence. The reality is that we all lose our innocence. We do that when we make decisions. It's unavoidable. If it hadn't been this relationship that was the turning point for her, it would have been something else. We all lose this innocence and we lose it time and time and time again. Okay, not sure what I'll be back with next time. Maybe it needs to be something a little more light-hearted. We'll see.